Hi, everyone. You're listening to MEnbar, the podcast for the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Marc Owen Jones. And today we are really lucky to be joined by Justin Dargin, who is a senior visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. It's great to have you here, Justin.
Oh, great. Thank you for having me, Mark.
And today we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic and especially pertinent to Qatar, where we are, which is about LNG, but more specifically about I suppose Qatar's foray into the world of renewable energy. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So, Justin, great to have you here and great to have someone with your expertise on this topic. You've just recently written a couple of policy briefs on Qatar's LNG exports, but also solar energy. Mm-hmm. But first, we'll talk about LNG.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
So, one of your briefs recently highlights Qatar's massive LNG expansion plans. Just the benefit of everyone, LNG is liquid natural gas. And aiming to control 25% of the global market, is that correct? By 2030?
That's correct.
Yeah. So but beyond market share, though, what are the geopolitical implications you foresee as Qatar's strength, as it strengthens its position as the dominant global LNG supplier, particularly as countries race to secure energy supplies amid ongoing conflicts?
Sure, absolutely. Well, there are several geopolitical implications of Qatar rapidly expanding its LNG sector and its LNG exports. One of the most important is that it would put it in market share competition with the U.S., Australia, and Russia. Now, if we break these down in its constituent parts, for instance, the U.S., under the Trump administration, has pledged to rapidly increase U.S. oil production and also natural gas and LNG exports as part of the Trump administration's America First policy. So energy exports and production is a key pillar of this America First strategy. So, of course, the Trump administration and also LNG companies in the U.S., they want to export much more to Europe, and they want to export to Asia. And, of course, this will put it in market share competition with Qatar, which, as you correctly indicated, wants to rapidly increase its LNG production and export to the global market. Now, in terms of Australia, Australia wants to increase its LNG production as well, and it's another major LNG producer. And Australia predominantly focuses on East Asia. So Qatar sees that East Asia is actually one of the primary demand increase export zones.
Right.
So Qatar recognizes that in Europe, demand is going to decrease over the long term. So it has to pivot to Asia as being one of the most important import zones.
Sorry, I don't mean to, but I'm just curious, why would it decrease in Europe? Just for the benefit of the audience, is that due to decarbonization? Is that due to the potential Russian gas coming back on the market?
No, I don't really foresee Russian gas coming back in the market because the diversification plans of Europe, and they have been in place actually for over a decade, so even prior to the Ukraine incursion.
Okay.
There is overall decarbonization policies in Europe that are beginning to take hold. I mean, so we can see energy efficiency policies and decarbonization. I mean, so we can see that over the long term, there's going to be, mid to long term actually, there's going to be quite a significant downward shift in Europe's natural gas import needs. I mean, so there has to be some type of diversification in terms of security of demand for Qatar. And in addition to that, there's also increased competition with U.S. LNG exports to European market. So we can look at the European market being relatively, even though there has been an uptick due to the diversification from Russian natural gas imports, Qatar would not be able to depend on the European market for the long term. So it has to shift to East Asia and then potentially down the line to Africa or South America, and we can get into that later.
Yeah, I mean, just as an point in the potential U.S. competition now, do you think Europe will be more likely to import from the U.S. than Qatar if it was an even playing field? I mean, is there some politics now to that?
Yeah, well, that's actually a great question. I mean, there are several facets to that. So on one hand, we can see that the Trump administration is utilizing, to a certain degree, the stick approach in the sense of threatening that it would implement tariffs if countries do not, let's say, acquiesce to certain trade policies. And one part of that may be and looks to be LNG trade as well. I mean, so this approach, though, it can backfire. I mean, so that's one of the issues with utilizing this. Although we can see that some initial signs it appears to be working with certain countries, such as, let's say, potentially South Korea, looking to maintain its trade relationship with the U.S., potentially through the purchase of more American LNG. However, Qatar has had longstanding relationships with several European countries as well. So Qatar will continue to be a reliable supplier to Europe, but the issue is it just can't depend on the European market for the mid to long term.
Right, and just to clarify, you think the Asian market, or at least Southeast Asia you mentioned?
No, East Asia.
East Asia,
yes.
And that's going to grow, remain stable, or decrease over time in terms of gas demand?
Yeah. Well, great. That's a great question. So if we look at the long-term projections, Qatar will have to depend on China and potentially India as well, South Korea. Although if we look at, for instance, more mature LNG importers such as Japan, they have been a reliable customer of Qatar for a very long time. Although it seems that their demand is going to decrease due to the imposition or the implementation, of renewable energy policies, and then also overall decarbonization throughout its national economy.
All right, so is Qatar making hay while the sun shines?
I would say yes, because due to the rapid expansion plans, Qatar recognizes that market competition is on the horizon.
Right.
I mean, so it's going to have to compete with other LNG suppliers based on cost, based on also ease of transport. So Qatar sits at the crossroads of, as we know, 3 continents. I mean, so the shipping time is actually much less than from the U.S. to the primary import countries in East Asia. I mean, so Qatar does have significant advantages. And even if we look at the cost of production from the North Field, which the cost of production is actually much lower than shale gas production in the U.S. And then in addition to that, if we see that Qatar is beginning to implement a policy of carbon intensity reductions throughout its value chain in terms of LNG, and in particular with the upstream, then it aims to position its LNG as being a much more less carbon intensive, much more environmentally viable LNG for countries that are implementing much stricter emissions and environmental standards, as compared to, let's say, the U.S. or Australia.
Right, so it's more like carbon-friendly carbon.
That is correct.
More carbon-friendly carbon.
That is correct, yes.
But, I mean, you just touched on it then. I mean, you mentioned Qatar's unique approach to decarbonization, focusing on sector-specific targets rather than national net zero commitments like its neighbors, right? I mean, what factors influence this strategic difference? And does this sectoral approach provide Qatar with advantages or disadvantages in the international climate negotiations? And maybe you could say what you mean by sector-specific targets.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, sector-specific targets are, instead of other countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia or the UAE, who have pledged net zero, let's say net zero policies to be in place, or have actually pledged that they will reach net zero by a certain date.
It's quite a bold move.
Right, it's quite a bold move, but this is for the national economy overall. Right, so these are national net zero policies. Although with Qatar recognizes that it has a very unique economy, which is quite different than its neighbors. So, for instance, Qatar has a pretty small population, of course, and then it has a very massive and overwhelming LNG sector, so natural gas sector. I mean, so, and also a few concentrated industrial zones. So it wouldn't necessarily make sense for Qatar to implement, let's say, a national economy, let's say a net zero pledge. It really wouldn't make sense. So what it decides to focus on instead is looking at how it would be able to make its LNG much more carbon competitive, if I were to use that term. So looking at on the horizon, there are various EU regulations that are going to take place that would impose certain restrictions on LNG imports. So Qatar is taking a very proactive step and recognizing that by trying to lock in carbon intensity reductions throughout its LNG value chain by 25% in the upstream sector, it would be able to differentiate itself in the market vis-a-vis its major competitors.
Such as the US or Australia?
US, Australia, and Russia, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay. So there, I mean, I from what I understand, especially in the recent administrative change in the US, sort of decarbonizing the supply chain, I suppose, is not a priority.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, there's been what you could call perhaps, let's say from the standpoint of environmentalists, a step back.
Yeah.
I mean, so we can see that since decarbonization and certain environmental regulations are no longer policy priority in the U.S. now with the new administration, Qatar would have that step forward for EU, and as the EU is often a front runner in terms of environmental regulations and so on and so forth, other nations could actually pick that up in East Asia and so on and so forth. And we also see the signs of Japan beginning to recognize that it would have to have much more environmentally friendly LNG imports. So we can see that the EU sets certain policies and then it reflects and mirrors itself in other countries later on. I mean, so because of this, because of, let's say, the return of the Trump administration's return to, let's say, a hydrocarbon-centric policy in the U.S., this serves as a market differentiation, from Qatar that would be able to meet the EU's evolving environmental regulations.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if that then gives Qatar an advantage with the EU market as opposed to, say, the US. But like you said, maybe they have other sticks that they might use. I don't know. How robust are these? Do you think these EU requirements are in terms of, where they source their gas? The article discusses Qatar's carbon capture ambitions, right? Including plans for the LNG industry's largest CCS facility in Ras Laffan, right? This is really interesting. How realistic are these ambitions or Qatar's carbon sequestration goals? And what challenges, technical or economic, do you think they'll face in doing this?
Well, I mean, I would say if we look at the enabling factors, the enabling factors are quite strong.
Okay.
I mean, so Qatar has certain depleted gas reservoirs, gas fields that it would be able to sequester the carbon in. Qatar has significant state-backed financial resources as well. So through the deployment of CCS, in addition, Qatar would be able to showcase and be able to let's say, a proof of concept, I suppose, that CCS can be a viable tool that can be deployed globally to lock in hydrocarbon natural gas for the long term. I mean, so this is very important, not just domestically for Qatar and its credentials, environmental credentials, but also by showing that potentially CCS is a proven technology. One of the problems with this is that CCS, while it works, there are still certain technical challenges and also certain challenges in the sense of making it financially viable. So if we look at a cost structure of about 50 to 100 per ton of carbon that is captured, carbon dioxide that is captured by CCS. I mean, we have to really tease out the opportunity cost of that. Okay. I mean, so is that viable if you have a certain natural gas price or LNG price, and then you try to sequester the carbon that is emitted during the value chain? I mean, so does that make economic sense, right? So we really have to bring down the cost structure of CCS to make it much more economically viable for it to be deployed worldwide. And then, of course, there are certain concerns about whether the carbon which is sequestered will be there for the long term, or whether there would be leakage.
How does that? I mean, do you know how it actually works? This sequestering. What's the process of? I mean, how does the CCS facility work? Do you know?
Yeah. I mean, one of the best ways I can explain it, just to simplify it, is that you basically put something over the emitting source,
right?
And then you have a pipeline, and then what the pipeline would be able to basically store that or put it in a type of reservoir, let's say, or any place in the ground. But you have to make certain that the structure, the formation, is actually robust enough whereby the carbon dioxide is not going to leak. I mean, just in a very simplistic way, just to put it like that.
No, of course, yeah.
Right. So
it might be useful for our listeners just to sort of imagine what that carbon capture. It literally is what it says it is.
Right.
Carbon
Absolutely.
capture.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked a bit about the EU's methane regulations. So, I mean, we don't necessarily need to go back to that. But I just want to. You talked also about Qatar being a small population, and therefore it doesn't have the same gas allocation challenges due to its small population. Than as its neighbors, right?
Right, absolutely.
So, I mean, to what extent, just out of curiosity, and I think for comparison then, when you say its neighbors, you're talking about Saudi, UAE?
Correct. And even Kuwait,
in Kuwait.
Oman.
They're using a lot of their carbon hydrocarbons to basically power their own infrastructure.
Correct.
Is that
Correct.
right?
Absolutely.
And does that mean that they're unable then to export as much or at all?
Yeah, well, you hit on a very important point there, Mark.
Yeah.
So basically, what happened during, you can even say post-1973, right? So post the oil embargo, a massive infusion of funds, a redirection even of funds went west to east, where typically most of, let's say, revenue generation was going towards the west.
Right.
So we see a redirection of funds due to the fact that there was a tripling or even quadrupling of the oil price from about $3 to about $12 per barrel. Yeah. So in today's dollars, we can just imagine billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, let's say, being funneled to the Gulf countries just within a period of several weeks.
Right.
Right. So
it's phenomenal when you think about it. Right?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, this was only rivaled in history, I would say, due to the privatization that occurred in the Soviet Union, privatization of state-owned industries in terms of wealth transfer, or even the gold and silver that was extracted or exploited even from Latin America going to imperial Spain during 16th, 17th century or so on. Right. So, I mean, this was a period of momentous change. So what happened was, due to this vast, just enormous, momentous infusion of wealth, the countries engaged in a rapid spending spree, mega projects, and industrialization, and so on and so forth. So what we can see is, if we fast forward to, let's say, the 1990s, 2000s, early 2000s, the natural gas demand rate was increasing to about 6 to 8% per year.
Really? That's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. And at that time, many of the countries were dependent on associate natural gas. Now, associate natural gas is the gas which is produced alongside oil. So if you look at those scenes in movies where you see just a huge gusher coming out of the ground of oil, what powers that is natural gas. Right. So natural gas is viewed as a byproduct of the mainstay of their economies, which was oil production. Right. So they didn't try to, let's say, produce from gas fields which were not associated with oil.
Were they flaring it or what?
A lot of it was flaring. A lot, because they actually in the 1970s, a lot of the natural gas was deemed as being non-value added. Right. So just gas was being flared, leaked, and so on and so forth.
I think Iraq still has that problem.
Many countries do. Actually, it's still an issue in many of the Gulf countries, actually, to be absolutely fair about that, although they've been able to handle it somewhat. I mean, so going back to the early 2000s, that's when you had this very stark increase in natural gas demand. And then what happened was the demand began to outpace the production of associate natural gas due to giving very low pricing structure in terms of residential power tariffs, and then also just a massive industrialization that was occurring. So about 2007, 2008, 2009, every single energy-rich country in the MENA region, except for Qatar, had gas allocation crises. So there were blackouts, even blackouts in the UAE and Dubai. Many people don't remember that. There were rolling blackouts in many other countries, and actually that ate into their ability to export LNG, because they had to redirect that to the domestic market.
Because it was being used to fire electricity plants.
Electricity, right. And for the residential market, which is relatively non-productive, I guess we can say, in terms of residential, not necessarily the industrial sector. I mean, so something had to happen. And what happened was these countries began to, and the Arab Spring played a role as well. I mean, so if you look at having to diversify your economy, having to industrialize, and so on and so forth. So that's when you began to see the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on, Kuwait, and so on and so forth, beginning to take climate change seriously, because this was in their economic best interest, because decarbonization basically equals a reduction in your natural gas demand. So that was one of the primary reasons for, let's say, 2012, when the Gulf countries, let's say, acquiesced or agreed to the Durban Platform, which is agreement to agree to the Paris Agreement that occurred several years later.
So there's a real economic driver for
national security, actually.
National security as well,
national security, because if the Gulf countries, indeed any country, if they weren't able to meet to uphold the social contract and to create a viable employment base moving forward, considering the demographic bulge many of the countries were facing, and then also the echoes of the Arab Spring, this was viewed as a very high priority for many of the countries to diversify and to be able to maintain relevant in the post-oil world.
The rentier paradigm seems more relevant than ever.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a really helpful, actually, sort of mini history of I suppose, gas allocation crisis in the Gulf, and I think that's going to be really helpful for our listeners. I want to talk now about this idea of climate partnerships, right? And I mean, I've fast forwarded a little to your conclusion in your paper, but you suggest Qatar could enhance its geopolitical influence through climate partnerships with the global south. Can you elaborate on what these partnerships might look like and how they could serve Qatar's interests in a sort of post-oil world? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that Qatar has, while it has an activist stance, a very, let's say, goal-oriented, strategically calibrated approach to its foreign policy. Thus far, in terms of international climate negotiations, it has taken much more of a, let's say, reactive or passive stance. And basically what I propose is that this should change because there has been increasing scrutiny of natural gas in international climate negotiations, particularly if we look at COP28, for instance, okay? Right. So there's been increasing scrutiny of hydrocarbons. And this was the overall trajectory. So anyone could see that this was going to occur, I mean, since 1992. So there has been a shift from the aggregate emissions profile of a particular country to looking at the source of those emissions, i.e. hydrocarbons. So that is a revolution in the conceptual matrix of how hydrocarbons are viewed, right? So hydrocarbons are now officially being targeted. And it has moved consistently from coal to oil, and now natural gas is under increasing scrutiny. So what Qatar should do, I would say in my humble opinion, is that it has to make certain that its LNG sector, which is the mainstay, of course, of its economic growth, remains robust and can still lead economic growth, not just for Qatar, but actually for the world moving forward. So one of the ways that I propose that it could be done is through climate diplomacy, carbon partnerships. What does this mean? That means, for instance, if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative that China has, it links soft loans to, let's say, concessions in countries in the global south, and thereby it forms these strategic partnerships with these countries. So, for instance, as I indicated earlier, the EU market for the long term is not a market that Qatar should necessarily be able to depend upon. Asian market is going to be highly contested. Right, if we see the the U.S., even Russia pivot east because Europe, right? So Qatar should be looking at the global south, Africa, South America, and let's say through the provision of soft loans, let's say to invest in LNG import infrastructure, then it would be able to link and also energy poverty concerns, which are quite significant in Africa and also Latin America to a great degree, Southeast Asia. So it'd be able to help meet their needs for reliable, consistent power generation through natural gas, and then also strategically link or align international carbon or climate negotiations to be able to make certain that natural gas is not unfairly penalized in these negotiations. And through that, there can be a very powerful front that makes certain that there's an understanding of historical responsibility in terms of international climate negotiations, and that countries which are just on the cusp of industrializing, that they necessarily shouldn't have to pay the debt that has been incurred by the global north, to be absolutely fair, through unfettered access to and production of hydrocarbons, often from the colonized countries, to be able to industrialize. I mean, so what I propose is that through linkage, through investment, and also the construction of long-term, of LNG import infrastructure, investment in those, then linking that with long-term LNG import contracts for this. So Qatar would be able to ensure that it has a growing and dynamic long-term import zone for its LNG. So locking in those customers.
And by customers also, they'd be customers, but as, in a sense, a constituency or community who have a stake then in ensuring that there is a place for I suppose more decarbonized LNG.
Right. Absolutely. And then also Qatar would take its role as being a proponent of development in the global south, right? So as a spokesman, very vocal, very proactive, and I think that Qatar has all the tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, you mentioned it, and obviously it's a podcast, we can't show, but we were able to show the graph of the extent to which, for example, industrialized nations who had contributed to climate change, that becomes a very stark reality.
Oh,
right?
it's quite a stark. I mean, Qatar for itself had only contributed about 0.3%.
Right.
Even though it's unfairly targeted international climate negotiations, and the fact that
and just generally in the press when it comes to a story about Qatar, it's like, wow, it's got the highest, what's it?
Per capita.
Yeah, per capita.
Yeah.
But I mean, this comes up here, and I think this is a really interesting point. Now you've mentioned it, right? It's like, your analysis does touch on the paradox of Qatar having one of the highest per capita carbon emissions, right? While its total national emissions remain comparatively low, right? But does this tension influence Qatar's climate diplomacy, right? Particularly in discussions about historical responsibility and climate justice? Or as you said, do you think that example of that climate partnerships is actually the best way to deal with that question or accusation?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. So what I would say is that so far Qatar has been undertaking, let's say, a more defensive, reactive, let's say, place due to, let's say, certain negotiations, international climate negotiations. I mean, so what is happening now, we can see that there is much more of a cognitive understanding, let's say in the Global South. Countries with significant hydrocarbon reserves in the Global South, such as the African Union has been promoting, that they should defend the production of natural gas for the global economy. And then also what Qatar says is that, yes, it does have the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world, but at the same time, the reason why it has so is because it's been exporting its natural gas to developed countries, which has been displacing oil and coal. So it's actually been contributing to the energy transition. I mean, this unfair targeting of Qatar and also other...
So also an unfair metric.
Right. Absolutely.
It's a high per capita because you've got a small population.
Right. I mean, absolutely. So you put all these together. I mean, so this does inform the role that of Qatar in international climate negotiations. But I mean, thus far, I mean, the more, let's say, proactive countries, and actually quite strident to a certain degree, have been Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they have been, let's say, promoting the interests of, let's say, the Arab bloc within international climate negotiations. But I mean, Qatar has a space at the table, and Qatar should be putting its viewpoint, just lay its cards on the table, and then also be able to promote strategic alliances that would more fully let's say, enhance the profile of its LNG sector and showcase its credentials as well, green credentials.
And as a diplomatic tool and a way of engaging with the Global South and contributing to development.
Absolutely.
So let's talk now, we talked about LNG, but let's talk about solar, right? Because Qatar is also pursuing its own, I suppose, renewable energy infrastructure, right? I mean, you talk about Qatar's solar ambitions, like is it the Al Kharsa plant? With an upcoming, forgive me if I get my figures wrong, 2 gigawatt Dukhan project. And Qatar is aiming for 4 gigawatts of solar energy by 2030. Do you think they're being ambitious enough, given the incredible solar resources? For those of you who don't live in Qatar, it's very sunny. Was it 9.5 hours of daily sunlight?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that sufficient? And are they being ambitious enough? And also, is this for domestic use? I mean, what's the purpose of this solar energy? Is it to defray domestic demand? I mean, could you talk to us about Qatar's solar ambitions?
Right. I mean, ambitious enough. I mean, we have to put that in context. I mean, so first of all, Qatar has an extremely small population.
Yeah.
Its domestic power demand is not increasing rapidly. I mean, such as we saw, let's say, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that they were experiencing in the late 2000s. I mean, so there isn't the dynamic need for Qatar to invest in domestic solar energy generation. I mean, that's not necessary. And also given the relatively low carbon emissions not even relatively low, actually quite low carbon emissions that Qatar has, 0.3% of its contribution, for instance, to the global total. I mean, so I would say just the fact that Qatar is doing it regardless, I think that is a step in the right direction. But if we were to talk about, let's say, if Qatar could do more, I mean, sure. Qatar could, do more potentially. I mean, but of course, Qatar is not a major contributor to climate change. But yes, I mean, if Qatar were, let's say, to implement a much more flexible regulatory policy, which would create much more enabling factors that would allow the deployment of are not allowed, but which would stimulate much more development of solar energy within Qatar. Sure, it could let's say increase that let's say by about 3 gigawatts by 2030 or so. I mean, so yeah, I mean, Qatar could be more ambitious with that, but if we look at, if we put it into context, it's not really necessary. And again, to just go back to the issues that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were facing in late 2000s, there was a significant need for those countries to invest in renewable energy. I mean, they had to.
But they're going nuclear, or thinking of going nuclear, aren't they?
Qatar?
No, the UAE. And even Saudi does.
Yeah, the UAE has gone nuclear.
Has gone nuclear.
Right, so right. Yeah, it has a significant amount of now nuclear energy, which is powering its domestic power mix, for instance. And then also Saudi Arabia is investing in nuclear energy. So nuclear energy is a very interesting topic that
yeah, we don't need to go down
right,
that.
It's a bit prestige also as well. Then there's also some transferability to other sectors, I guess we can say. I mean, so, but overall, I would say that Qatar just doesn't have the need, but the fact itself that it is able to do so, it would be able to retain some of the natural gas that is being currently supplied to domestic market. Then it would be able to export more, but it wouldn't necessarily be such a significant amount.
Is it, is this solar kind of farm in Khalsa, this desire to get to 4 gigawatts, is this a symbolic thing? Or does it tie in with the sector-specific needs to decarbon the supply chain of gas? Is it related to that at all, or is it entirely different?
Yeah. So I mean, so if we look at decarbonization of the LNG value chain, which is aligned with Qatar's overall perspective on how it should approach decarbonization as opposed to a national pledge of net zero. Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, Qatar is looking for the provision or deployment of renewable energy for reduction of carbon intensity throughout its LNG value chain. And then in addition to that, of course, you have the fact that Qatar, such as other countries, has pledged certain GHG, greenhouse gas emissions reductions as well. And also to showcase that it is taking a step in the right environmental ecological direction as the rest of the world as well. So I mean, so you have these all of these factors as well.
Multitude.
Right? And then there's also, as I indicated earlier, there's also a minimal reduction in the opportunity cost of supplying natural gas to a domestic market at very low rates, as opposed to international market rates that you can get through export.
Right. So enough for maybe a few bonuses.
All right. Precisely.
But I mean, just the benefit maybe of our audience, like 4 gigawatts by solar capacity by 2030. I mean, a single gigawatt here or 4 gigawatts, what kind of demand would that satisfy in the local market?
We could see perhaps about 18, about maybe 21%.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that is, yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, I was on Google Earth and I think I saw they recently updated it, so I was actually looking at the size of it.
Oh,
and it's massive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge. These are massive undertakings, to be absolutely fair.
Yeah.
So, I mean, take it back to your point. Yes, I would say it actually is ambitious, in particular when you put it in the context of Qatar's needs and so on.
Justin, that's great. I mean, is there anything you want to add that we haven't discussed? We've gone through the questions.
I mean, I would say you hit all of the main points now, Mark. I mean, what I would just say is that Qatar is really on the cusp of being able to take steps that would maintain its strategic edge in a rapidly approaching post-oil, post-hydrocarbon age. But again, very important that really countries in the region have to be quite proactive and to recognize that they simply cannot sit on their laurels and that they have to see the Global South as well as being a very important partner moving forward to maintain their economic mainstay for the next several decades.
I think a partner, yes, and I think it's also opportunity for some level of leadership.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. No, in the multipolarity that is developing, as they tend to say.
Absolutely. I think we need to check in on this every year for updates from Justin.
Absolutely, pleasure.
Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've been listening to Justin Dargin, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Marc Owen Jones, and you've been listening to MEnbar, the podcast for the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, as I said again. Please tune in wherever you get your podcasts, and look forward to seeing you, I suppose, for the next show.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for listening to MEnbar, the podcast for the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.